Peter Maravellis here. I hope this finds you all safe and well in these crazy, crazy times. On behalf of City Lights booksellers and publishers, I'd like to welcome you to City Lights Live, the virtual reading series that continues in the footsteps of our in-store calendar during the shelter in place. We continue to celebrate the works of authors we know and love with readings, discussions, and forums throughout the fall season and into the winter. For those of you that don't know already, City Lights has reopened its doors to the public. Following San Francisco Health Department guidelines, we aim to make your visit to City Lights as safe as possible. Please do come and visit us. You'll be able to once again browse our stacks. Our business hours are 7 days a week from 12 noon to 8 p.m. We've worked very hard to transform the store for the age of COVID. The entrance is now on the Broadway side of the building. It's actually at 271 Columbus. The original entrance is now an exit only. We do encourage everyone, please do wear a facial covering while visiting. We're making our efforts to kind of keep things safe for everybody. So as many of you know, City Lights is a publishing house as well as a bookstore. We continue to publish in the grand tradition of Lawrence Ferlinghetti's seminal Pocket Poet series. We continue to produce on a seasonal basis new books of poetry, fiction, literature and translation, and nonfiction informed by a progressive political outlook. We have new titles out from David Barsamian, from Stan Cox, also a very timely book by Alan Hirsch about our current electoral crisis. Also a new book by the 21st Poet Laureate of the United States, Juan Felipe Herrera, as well as new poetry from Uchi Naduka and Sophia Dolan in the Spotlight Poetry Series. So to learn more about our books, as well as our open coming events, please visit us on our website at www.citylights.com. You can also keep up on our activities on social media. We have a presence on Instagram, on Twitter, on Facebook. You can also subscribe to our newsletter and receive weekly updates on new City Lights releases, as well as all our up and coming events. So we're also happy to announce that our neighbor Vesuvio Cafe is also open for business. They have set up chairs up in Kerouac Alley. So please come on down, buy a beer and a book. So tonight, we are thrilled to be hosting Mauro Javier Cárdenas, celebrating the launch of his new novel titled Aphasia. It's published by our friends over at Farrar Straus Giroux. Mauro is the author of The Revolutionaries Try Again, which the New York Times called an original insubordinate novel. In 2017, the Hay Festival included him in Bogota 39, a selection of the best young Latin American novelists working today. We've hosted Mauro before at City Lights. He usually takes on the role of interlocutor. So we're really, really happy to actually have him and be hosting him for his very own book. And really, a really awesome book it is. So he's going to be joined in conversation by Carlos Fonseca. Carlos is a lecturer in Latin American literature and culture at Trinity College in the University of Cambridge in the UK. He is the author of Kernel Lagrimas, published by Restless Books, and Natural History, published by Farrar Straus Giroux. In 2016, he was named one of the 20 best Latin American writers at the Guadalajara Book Fair. And in 2017, he was included in the Bogota 39 list of best Latin American writers under 40. So tonight, you will be able to purchase copies of both Mauro and Carlos's books via the link we're going to be posting in the chat function of our Zoom room. It can be activated by scrolling over the buttons in the dashboard at the bottom of your screens. You can also use that same function to ask questions. We're going to have a Q&A at the end. So please welcome Mauro Javier Cárdenas and Carlos Fonseca.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Peter. Mauro, so good to see you. How are you?
Good to see you too. Hey, and hello to everybody from all over the world, and my compatriots from Ecuador that I see. Also, if I know that we're in the middle of waiting for results for the election, if any states get called while we're talking, please post it in the chat so that we can celebrate.
Exactly. I'm so grateful for everybody, also to City Lights for hosting this event. There's so much happening right now, but like I guess the people here know what's really important, Mauro, which is your book, right? And celebrating it today, like I must say, you know, it's a magnificent, like stylistically, formally innovative book, like one of the best books that I have read this year. I have told you many times, so I'm like happy to be able to say it out loud and in public. And just kind of like background information for everybody. Back in the day, like I think 3 or 4 months ago, Mauro and me, we were just basically speaking through WhatsApp and trying to like figure out what kind of tied both of our books together. And we came, or basically Mauro came with this like great idea of like narrative potentiality. Basically, like it seems, Mauro, that we're both interested in how like literature proliferates from literature, how like storytelling proliferates from storytelling, and writing kind of like just like acts like a machine that produces more writing. And the interesting thing with like Mauro's novel, Aphasia, is that this kind of narrative potentiality or like proliferation stems precisely from an erasure or a sense of like an absence of the very sense of it. And that's maybe like where I wanted to start talking to you about the novel, Mauro. Like, tell me a little bit about this idea of a potentiality or like a proliferation that kind of like starts from an erasure. Something has happened to the protagonist, something horrible to his sister, and it is around that absence that like kind of you build this like never-ending kind of like proliferation of stories.
Yeah, I think the concept of erasure, has been in my mind even in my first novel. Actually, there was a failed experiment where what I would do is I would write a sentence and I would put a statement in parentheses, and then I would blank it out, and then the next morning I would read a sentence again and try to react to that blank. And I did it a few times. It didn't quite work. It didn't make it into the novel, but I was really sort of interested in that notion that, many of us sort of go through life in our brain for whatever reason, whether it's because of, the sort of the psychological explanation is that your brain erases sort of traumatic experiences because it tries to help you remain alive and so on. It's a really bizarre concept, actually, right? But there are many reasons why the brain erases kind of situations that have happened to you that are unpleasant. And of course, it also erases things that are not unpleasant. Your brain just erases things almost at random sometimes. It feels like. And so I was always very interested in that notion from a narrative perspective, meaning like oftentimes in fiction, we pretend that we remember a scene. So a character remembers a scene from his childhood and the scene is fully realized, right? Like the character, like, has all the senses engaged in the scene, like everything, the dialogue, all of it is kind of laid out in sort of traditional fashion as if the character can remember the scene completely. And that's just not my experience. Like I can't remember a lot of things. And and the things that I remember are little pieces, right? And of course, and this is not surprising, is that they get sort of connected to things that happen after. So the memory is always being associated. And so it's almost like a memory that has all these erasures proliferates by the fact that they are things that you read, there are movies you watch, they are sort of art objects that start connecting to that sort of partially erased memory. And you don't do it on purpose, right? It's almost like you're just connecting all these things. And then, and I'm not even talking about the writing, I'm just talking about how I feel my brain works sometimes. But then in the writing, what you're trying to do is to say, okay, if I'm going to do away with sort of the sort of traditional way of creating scenes, and I'm really going to focus on the character's sort of emotional impulses, and if that impulse is to forget, to erase, and at the same time to exist with those erasures, then the idea of proliferation helps, right? Because you can take a very minute memory or an erasure and then connect it to all these different things, right?
Yeah. And something that strikes me as interesting from the novel is the fact that like, in order to like build such a complex structure, you kind of have to like tear everything apart, right? So you have to like tear away, like, so we talked before about like tearing away like traditional notions of psychology or traditional notions of realism within the novel. And you bring this into play within the novel when you mention the idea of an architecture by this magnificent guy that I had never heard of until like I read Aphasia, and I loved his work, which is Richard Greaves. So I thought perhaps it would be good for us to like do some readings, and then I can ask you so people get a sense of like what is this like proliferating style that we're talking about, and who is this guy Richard Greaves that like was kind of influential in like at least how I read what you're doing.
Definitely.
So that's, I believe, like around page 26.
Page 26. Okay. All right. So this is actually from the first chapter that I wrote in the book, and is the chapter that starts with a very simple impulse, which is Antonio is pondering his relationship to nature, his non-relationship to nature, because he is thinking about submitting an essay to a magazine, right? And so I'll read from page 26. He searches through the alternative guide to the universe catalog and finds that the artist responsible for the vague garbological assemblages Antonio has been associating with the decision management hub that has shuttered his window into nature is called Richard Greaves, who apparently studied theology and hotel management and quit his job to dedicate himself to assembling his own asymmetrical visions of the world out of abandoned barns, coffee makers, nicked shovels, computer keyboards, all razors, twine, rope. A nail stops the evolution, Richard Greaves says, but a rope is patient, parsing discarded objects in the forests of Quebec based on his nebulous linkages to them, Antonio writes. And as Antonio marvels at how what seemed like an incondite associative thread turned out to be quite pertinent to his reflections about his non-relationship to nature, he imagines Richard Greaves spreading his cargo of trash on a kitchen table, trying to find linkages between gnarled tricycles, giant tacks, newsletters about toolboxes, recognizing that this image of Richard Greaves has its origins in Vertigo by W.G. Siebold. And here Antonio searches online inside Vertigo for the word table, and finds the passage that, according to him, describes his own method of composition. I sat at a table near the open terrace door, W.G. Siebold writes, my papers and notes spread out around me, drawing connections between events that lay far apart, but which seemed to me to be of the same order.
So that's wonderful, because like I think there, like you indirectly tell us a little bit about your procedure as well, right? So like when I remember when I read the novel at the first time, I said, okay, so like what Mauro is doing is a little bit like the architecture of like Richard Greaves. He's tearing everything apart and kind of building from like this like debris or ruins that are left behind. And I also like that idea from W.G. Siebold of kind of spreading everything and trying to find the constellations of meaning that could like be produced. And I remember that back in the day when I offered my blurb, in which I said something around the idea of like, well, what he's doing is like the architecture of Richard Greaves. Then 2 weeks afterwards, I looked at the cover and I was like, oh my goodness, people are going to think I didn't read the novel, because it's literally like what I describe in the blurb. But I guess that means that, like, first of all, the cover artist was a really good cover artist. Also had the same type of reading of the novel. And second of all, I guess I have to show today that I have read the novel. So that's also a good impulse, Mauro. But tell me a little bit about Richard Greaves. Who was he, and how we could think of the novel through the lens of like that idea of an architecture, or perhaps the idea that you bring into play with regards to Siebold and the papers were laid out in the floor.
Yeah, definitely. So I saw Richard Greaves' work in London, actually, many years ago, in that exhibit. And I was very moved by it, by kind of the messiness of it. The exhibit was actually about the alternative sort of guide to the universe, was really about all these sort of idiosyncratic individuals that were outside of the art world, that were never really considered artists, through the traditional sort of art galleries and museums. And there were all these strange sort of works that these very lonely people have done. I remember there was one woman who was a homeless woman that what they were showing was she would go into a photo booth and she would put on different outfits, and she would then take pictures of it. So the whole sort of wall was, this homeless woman, and that had, anyway. So it was that kind of art. And it was many years before that image of the Richard Greaves art came into the book. And it came the same way that anything comes into the book, which is I started that sentence simply by saying, okay, what happens if I put this guy called Antonio who works at a bank and an investment company, and he's trying to write about his relationship to nature, right? So that's the first step.
Yeah.
Then I say, then I as I write, I realize, okay, his relationship to nature is no relationship to nature. He does not remember anything about nature. Nature plays no role whatsoever in his mind or in his writing, right? So that immediately gave me the cue. Okay, so in this novel, setting is out, right? Because he doesn't relate to setting in that context. The second one is that as I was writing it, the rule is that I don't map out the sentence before I start. All I know is that there's an impulse. In this case, the impulse to write about nature, right?
Yeah.
Very general in a way. And then that impulse starts bringing stuff along. Every morning when I wake up, I was like, okay, now I have this piece. Now I'm going to write about what comes next. And it has to be whatever comes to mind. And so Richard Greaves came to mind very, very quickly. So I wrote about that. And then Sable came to mind. So I wrote about that. And then it's like those pieces start adding up, right? It started adding up, starting up. And the Sable sort of, that image had been in my mind for a long time, right? That notion of, organizing your work through kind of almost like a seance, right? How does this relate to one another? And part of what I like about that method is that I have felt that in fiction, oftentimes novels feel to me over-engineer when it comes to the structure. Mm-hmm. That, I was actually reading this book on cognitive science recently where it was arguing that certain words have a concept, and that concept already locks in the language that goes with it. Like when you say the word trauma, right? For instance, right? It locks already in your mind a certain amount of concept associated with trauma, a certain amount of language, a certain amount of grammar associated with it. And so it becomes really boring, right? Because you already kind of know what the cloud that relates to the concept is, right? And so for me, being able to write in that way where I'm not sort of, when I have a lot of freedom within the sentence, it's really what I was after, right? It's like that the reader will be excited about the fact that he doesn't know or she doesn't know when the sentence is going to end, where is it going to go next, where is it going to veer from Greaves to Sable to the sister, to the Bell Bondsman calling Antonio, you know what I mean? So all of that happens very naturally in a almost kind of, I would say, a free jazz kind of way,
Yeah. Mauro, and tell me, now that you mentioned jazz, I remember you telling me here in London that that you started experimenting with how you could with different lengths of sentences. And if I'm not mistaken, you told me something around the lines of and I figured out that the perfect length for me was what was it, 1,500 for this book or something?
Yeah, 1,500. Yeah.
1,500. Yeah. So tell me a little bit how you got to that. First of all, what was the exercise like? And would you do that sort of exercise of reading out loud, or was it just something that went through silence? Or
Yeah. What I noticed was that when you write these sentences that are not necessarily, their goal is not to advance a certain narrative, right?
Yeah.
I mean, even in Krasahorka, right? Certain sentences have a role of advancing the story of the character, and of course, there's all kinds of deviations. But it is pushing things forward. But when you're not writing a sentence or trying to push anything forward, other than to exhaust the impulse that you're after, right? Mm-hmm. Then what I noticed is that for most of the impulses that I was choosing as a starting point for the sentences, that around 1,500 words was where I ran out of steam. Where whenever I got to 2,000, 3,000, I would have to what came after the 1,500 mark was not as alive as what came before. And so roughly when I started then looking at my sentences, I saw that the ones that I liked best were the ones were around that length, meaning that the concept that I seem to be picking to sort of dramatize in these kind of sentences didn't lend themselves to more than that. So it was almost like, it wasn't that I planned it for the second book. It's just I noticed that that was the way it was happening. For the third book, I did sort of say, you know, whenever I go beyond that, I had to be very careful to make sure that I'm not just adding, that I'm not losing the steam. And so it's roughly 1,500 words from the third one, like almost every sentence.
You know, which other book reminded me of yours would be like Too Loud a Solitude? Because there is also that idea of like somebody just receiving kind of like book information from everywhere and kind of like in a garbage sort of way, like Richard Greaves trying to make something out of it, right? For this kind of like voice or monologue that pushes forward while also delaying something. But talking a little bit about delay, at the end of the day, this is a novel about delay. This is a novel that like in that sense, like resembles a 1001 Nights, even like Borges's El Milagro Secreto, right? Delaying something that is going to happen, right? Through storytelling. So in that sense, it would be great for us to hear you read from page 36, just a kind of like short excerpt there.
All right, here we go. This is from a chapter called The Revisionist by Helen Schulman. There's a number of chapters in the book that are titled after a short story because there's Antonio reading the short story. So this is Antonio reading a short story called The Revisionist. Why not do something as inevitable as being home on time for dinner? Antonio reads, not remembering having read this or any other thought from Harsh Leather, I don't know how to pronounce that name, the protagonist of The Revisionist, which Antonio has been rereading for almost a decade. And although he doesn't ever remember too many specifics from The Revisionist, he does remember the short fiction as 1, a performance of delay, 2, too dependent on its reversal at the end, 3, paradoxical because despite knowing about 2, he always cries in the end. And of course, once he rereads The Revisionist, as he's doing now, Hirsch Leather delay becomes less about 1, 2, 3, and more about Hirsch Leather's desire to delay his trajectory back home.
So good. So there we get like this idea of like the failure of memory, right? Not remembering, which you had mentioned before, and then this idea of the performance of delay, right? And that in a way is like how I see the novel as well. Like, you know, there is this storytelling that is delaying, at least like blocking that kind of traumatic event that you mentioned at the beginning. So tell us a little bit about perhaps delay and how it works within aphasia.
Yeah, definitely. So there is another novel by Sable Austerlitz that had a big influence on the book. It gets mentioned in a few places in the book, but it has a bigger effect structurally. As you know, in Austerlitz, the first half of Austerlitz is probably my favorite 100 pages in all the literature. Austerlitz is talking to a stranger, to the narrator. They met casually, right, in a train station, and the conversation is mostly about architecture, right? They talk about the architecture of train stations. They talk about the architecture of fortresses. And you as a reader have no idea what the story is about. There is no explanation why he's talking about fortresses and so on. And it's only right in the middle of a novel that, you know, the narrator runs into Austerlitz again, and Austerlitz tells him like, oh yeah, I just remembered I was in the train station that was about to be destroyed, and I remember that I was one of those kids during World War II that was sent from Germany to England, and I didn't remember. I didn't remember that I had different parents. So this very sort of traumatic event that was completely erased from him was driving a lot of the conversation, and the fact that he was sort of driven towards these sort of subjects that were related, right? Because the train station was a train station where, you know, he had to go through when he was a kid. The fortresses were actually later Nazi kind of jails. So I was always very interested in figuring out how do you do that, right? How do you write about something without writing about something? And it could turn to be really awful too, right? Because like then it becomes almost like a game. It's like, oh, how do I write about this without writing about that,
Yeah.
right? And so in Aphasia, the first half, that's actually a middle point, exactly a middle point where the novel changes. The first half is really about Antonio finding ways to not think about his sister, right? So he thinks about, former girlfriends. He thinks, he reads these books that are, and the stories are related to those. So there's a lot of freedom in that section, right? But it's also like all kind of like gravitating around the subject of the fact that his sister is missing. That his sister has lost her ability to distinguish between reality and so it's at the middle point of the novel where he falls asleep, and in a dream, it's called a reenactment dream, where he's reenacting a conversation that he had, a very painful conversation he had with his sister when she was kind of in this sort of altered state of mind. So I think that, and it's interesting because the second part, clearly that's when he connects with his sister again on the phone, and so on. So there is that shift in the novel in a way, but I think that's where it comes from, right? And less, I would say, from a less literary perspective, is really that I was very moved by the fact that finding sort of books that try to dramatize something that I've experienced in my own life, is just how certain erasures, you have to live with those erasures, right? And sometimes they come back, sometimes they don't come back, sometimes somebody tells you about it, and you're like, and you start imagining even though you don't remember. So
yeah, that was like a little bit my experience of reading it, because at the beginning I entered the book kind of trusting you, like you have to trust the narrative, right? And I was trusting your style particularly, which, like, of course, like is very impressive. And then I remember like one moment halfway through, as you mentioned, where I was like, no, this is something quite painful and like something quite profound, right? This is not just like a sort of game, as you were mentioning. And in that sense, like, it's a novel that constantly jumps between that kind of like very painful past and the present, and it kind of does this by like, providing ways of like rewinding, right, and rewriting. And that idea of rewinding and fast forward kind of like comes across in like page 64. So I thought maybe we could, like, you could read from that excerpt and we could talk a little bit about it.
Sure. There we go. So this is I don't think this one needs much explanation, but Silvina is a former girlfriend of Antonio. All this, of course, Silvina reads, indeed his whole history originated in the distant past, said Corin. And here Antonio rewinds a recording of Silvina reading from War and War by Laszlo Krasznahorkai, trying to remember where he recorded her. All this, of course, Silvina reads, indeed his whole history originated in the distant past, said Corin. No, Antonio thinks, he can't remember where he recorded her, so he rewinds the recording to the beginning again, listening to Silvina's voice again and thinking of Krapp's last tape, which he'd seen once by himself when he was still 25 or 22, and once years later with Dora. We lay there without moving, Krapp hears himself say, but under us all move, and move us gently up and down and from side to side. Rewinding to the same part of the recording where Krapp talks about a woman lying stretched on the floorboards with her hands under her head, her eyes closed, the whole world moving under them. All of this, of course, Silvina reads, indeed his whole history originated in the distant past, said Corin.
So wonderful. I just realized now, Mauro, that like, since your sentences are so long, nobody's ever gonna like hear you even say like a whole sentence out loud, which we must like ask forgiveness for, right? It's like, how does a sentence by Mauro Javier Cárdenas actually sound? It's a mystery, because it would take 2 or 3 minutes to hear it. But no, like, so I love this idea. Like, I think like Krapp's Last Tape is definitely one of my favorite plays from Beck, and it's a very touching play in which, like, at the same time as being comic, Krapp keeps rewinding to that scene of the woman that like happened a long time ago. So tell us a little bit about this idea of rewinding and kind of re-narrating the past, which seems to be like somehow at play here, at least with what you're doing.
Yeah, no, this is another one of the situations that multiple elements came together across time without me knowing it ahead of time. So one of the elements that happened many years ago was that I was volunteering to be a transcriber for an oral history project for Voice of Witness for a Colombia project. It was they were interviewing survivors of the Civil War, people who have been displaced or that they've lost loved ones. And for a few months, every Sunday, I would go to a cafe, I put these big headphones on, and I would listen to the audio of these oral histories, these people that were being interviewed, and my role was to transcribe it in Spanish. And I wasn't very good at it, right? So I'd never done it before, and so they gave me this software where you can sort of easily rewind, right? But I was always doing that. I was so caught up with what they were saying that I would like, oh crap, I need to rewind so I can transcribe. And then I would do that, rewind and transcribe, right? And I did that for a long time. And so that was one element. The other element is that I have seen Kraft's last tape a few times. And so when it came to write that sentence, I didn't plan it ahead. Those things came naturally, right? So this image of having someone listening to somebody that he used to love reading a sentence, right? Immediately came to Kraft's Last Day. I was like, oh yeah, I watched Kraft's Last Day. Kraft's Last Day became an image in my head. And then, I realized later that the fact that I had spent all the time sort of transcribing also had an impact, right? Because then not only in that passage, but in other passages where he's listening to his mother, right? He's transcribing his mother, right? And so those are the things that actually, my favorite thing about writing is exactly that, where I started writing and I'm like, oh yeah, this image from 10 years ago can connect to this image from 5 years ago, right? Can connect to something I just imagined today, right? All those things connecting almost in the act of writing is to me what is my favorite thing about writing.
Yeah, in a way, like almost writing is your way of linking all of your history as a reader as well, or as like a viewer of cinema, or all of sort of different art forms, right? It reminded me a little bit because also when we were here talking in London, you mentioned what was it, Gerald Murnane's which book was the one about his readings? And
yeah, the history of books, where he talks about the books he's read, but he never remembers the book he's read. What he remembers is what he was imagining while reading them, right? Which I found wonderful, right? Because it oftentimes in the book, in Aphasia, different moments, different readings, different books remind the character of, not necessarily oftentimes the language of what he's quoting, but what was happening, right? So I think there's a moment where he quotes Theodore Rothke, right? Like, I knew a woman lovely in her bones. That really comes to mind because he reminds me of someone that he used to work with that would tell him that his parents used to recite poetry to one another, and that they used to recite sort of that poem. And then it connects to that sort of notion of, because his coworker sort of talks about like being in a coma and like sort of waking up, and then the doctor asking him like, so tell us something so we know you're functioning. And he started reciting poetry, and they thought he was crazy, right? Anyway, so I forgot what I was trying to answer, but Murnau, yes, that's right. Yeah. Murnau, that notion, yes.
And talking about those readings, one that like kind of like figures prominently and links you to a couple of like magnificent books that I have read recently would be Bernhard, right? So like if they ask me 3 of the best books that I have read this year, what would tie them together would be Bernhard. So I'm thinking of like Katharina Boxmer's The Appointment, which I think we talked about. I'm thinking about Mark Haber's Reinhardt's Garden, and I'm thinking of your book as like kind of like a very beautiful triangle, like that has Bernhard somehow in the center. And even in the Latin American tradition, right, we have like amazing writers like Horacio Castellanos Moya or like Fernando Vallejo that also like take Bernhard as like the central kind of influence. And I have heard you in interviews talk a little bit about how correction was fundamental for writing this book. So perhaps like tell us a little bit about that, and like also how you, because I believe you have read also Volkmer's book and like
Oh yeah.
so it would be great to hear you like talk with regards to like what you're doing and like what you see them doing as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think my relationship to correction probably has a few different sort of levels, if we're going to call them. One is that I have felt that in that book, Bernhard does, and I think Antonio mentions this in the book, is that some of the recursiveness of Bernhard in that book is very similar to the ways that sometimes when somebody is having a psychotic attack and they are in an altered state of mind, the recursiveness is very similar, right? And in fact, I remember reading that Bernhard was oftentimes borderline in that sort of situation, right? And that writing was his way of sort of calming himself down. So that's one layer. The second one is, of course, in correction, the first half of correction has these very long sentences that are very musical, right? And very fugal and wonderful. So that obviously had an impact on my own sentences. The third one is that in the second part of correction, there is the narrator is going through his friend who committed suicide, going through his papers, right? And sifting and sorting them, right? So, and that connects to Senselessness by Moya, right? Where the character is actually editing the manuscript, right? So that notion of editing a manuscript or sort of reacting to a manuscript came into Aphasia, given that the characters often, reading a story or transcribing something. So that relationship to text also was, I think, influential. I also think that, I've been rereading correction recently. I also think that in that book, once you get sort of past the prose and the musicality and like the altered state of mind and all those sort of things that are, the setup is quite painful. Because the narrator, I didn't notice this the other times that I read it. Like the narrator is telling the story about his friend who committed suicide, who he had known since he was a kid, and they used to walk together to school when they were little, barefoot, and there were three of them, right? So Rosheimer, and then Hoyler, and then the narrator. All the three of them knew each other from they were kids, and the one who committed suicide went to the other friend's house to do all the work for the cone and his sister. So there's all this emotional stuff that Bernhard doesn't tell you explicitly. Oh my God, this is so painful because this was my friend. Blah blah blah. He just simply he does tell you, like, we used to walk to school together, and he does tell you, one day we went to the school and one of the teachers had hung himself, right? But he doesn't necessarily make the connections for you. He just says like, yeah, and of course maybe like this had some impact on him committing suicide later, but he never really melodramatizes any of that. It's just, and so I was very moved by all that way that he can combine this sort of very high modernist, long sentence, musical prose with like sort of a nihilist, sort of negative, all that combined with this sort of very emotionally charged situation that he doesn't really talk about in emotionally charged language.
Yeah, and that's, I feel like, how aphasia also works, right? Like in a way, like it has to kind of release itself from all of the common sense and melodrama that is already implied by how like we're just like made to function psychologically as human beings, even by the media and everything, and how we're brought up. And it has to kind of backtrack or moonwalk its way back before it can like move forward and try to like really get at like the pain that is at the center of this novel. And you have a wonderful phrase in the book that kind of like synthetically describes this, which you call the logic of ununderstanding. So it reminds me a little bit of like what you're saying, right? And how, we have to kind of break loose of that common sense in order to really see like the pain that is the life below, right?
I think so. I mean, I think that to me that connects a lot with just some fundamental questions about, I think we talked about this, right? What is it that I want fiction to be for me, right? And what is it fiction for? And although Aphasia is not really a conceptual novel in the sense of like your novel, I think your second novel, it's a conceptual novel because you remove psychology completely. I in Aphasia, unlike the one I'm writing right now, I hadn't yet removed all psychology. There's still quite a bit of it, but it's through negation, right? And it's through trying to say, what is it about this character or what has happened to him that he doesn't want to talk about, and that he will never be able to talk about in polite conversation to anyone, and that how do you dramatize that outside of the melodrama or those kinds of situations, right? I think there's a quote from Grace Pelling in the book around sort of plot sort of taking all hope away, because in psychology, like there's some things that we know from hundreds of years now, it feels like, from reading Freud, right? That what happened to us when we were kids has an impact on us as adults, right? The end, right? And so it is accepting that, but at the same time, in fiction, trying to get around that in some way,
Mauro, now that you're talking about the third novel, tell us a little bit about that kind of like, how do you approach the different like projects? I do see like clearly some like stylistic similarities between like the first novel and Aphasia. But tell us a little bit like, because it does seem to be that you think about projects like punctually, one at a time, as like a different poetic. So perhaps just like talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, what I realized is that so when I finished the first novel, in a way, the biggest influence in my second novel was my first novel, because my first novel was an amalgamation of all the styles and books and things that I read that I liked, and so it was almost like condensation of all those influences. And then out of that, I extracted. There's one sentence in particular in the first novel that has a style, where it has that impulse, a character that sort of talks about how he, even though people think that, the apparition of the Virgin Mary was because of mass delusion, that he was still there and he saw things and so on. And so that sentence, that is around 1,500 words. And I took that kind of sentence into the second one and say, okay, now I found this kind of sentence. How do I then make that into a novel, right? So that was kind of the relationship with the two. And the third one, it was really about, it's the same family, it's Antonio in the same family. But now in the third one, I take that style even to the extreme, where I take even more things out, and everything's a monologue. So there's no more of these, in my Aphasia, a few sentences at the beginning, especially, that kind of give you like, that introduce you to like what's happening. It starts with a monologue, right? Just somebody, I think it started with a character, Antonio's daughter, saying, take him, who needs a father anyway? Because in the third book, a lot of Americans have been deported. Antonio has been deported. One of his daughters left back to Colombia. And so it's like almost like a surrealist oral history. And in the fourth one, the one that I'm working on right now, is Antonio again sort of says, I am tired of writing about loss and trauma and all these things. What is it that I can write about if I take that out of a novel? So now we're in conceptual sort of novel territory, right?
Mauro, now that you mentioned Latin America, I know this is like a kind of like a stereotypical question, but like, so you write in English, but nonetheless, you write with these very long sentences that look more Latin American in style than kind of like English in a way. Tell me a little bit about your relationship with like Latin American literature. We have like amazing authors here like Gabriela Alemán, Claudia Hernandez, so that write in Spanish. So tell us a little bit about your relationship to that tradition and the decision to write in English.
Yeah, it's interesting, because this is something that Claudia and I think have talked about at some point, where my decision to write in English, for whatever reason, when I was young, I was like, oh, I'll write in English and show those Americans, I don't know if that's how it was, I really can't sort of I can give you different answers depending on the day. I don't remember anymore exactly why. I didn't know anything about publishing, right? So I figure, well, if I'm here, might as well write in English, right? But whatever the reason, the decision to write in English gave me some options and shut off some other options. The options that actually kind of were off the table were trying to capture the orality of English from different regions, right? Like how people speak in one region versus another. Something that other writers like Claudia does, right? Where like she tries to capture the orality of a certain region and a certain country. That was completely off the table for me because it's not something that I was interested in, and that's not how I relate to English. What it was, and the part that's exciting is that because my relation to English doesn't have that sort of like, in Spanish, like every word or a lot of the words have a sort of like a tree of associations, right? Like the word madre, the patio, all those things, all those words have connections to kind of your life in Latin America, my life in Latin America. And so those connections have create limitations, where in English, I had less of those. And so it's almost like I had the freedom to construct this syntax that was almost like artificial in a way, because the sentences are not really about how people really think or how people really talk. It's just creating an architecture that that sounds good and that reads good on the page, right? And I think that's kind of like the relationship to language. I think my relationship to Latin American literature is probably similar to yours and others that are with us. It's just there are wonderful writers in Latin America, just as in Hungary and Austria, and I like some of them. I don't like some of them. I take from every region in the world that I can, But I will say one thing, that when I was very young, and I started to kind of read Latin American literature, and this is probably before there was a lot of you could buy Latin American literature in Spanish like easily, like you can do now. You couldn't do that when I was starting to write. The San Francisco Library had a huge Latin American collection in Spanish, and that's when I first read By Night in Chile by Bolaño. So that short book had a big impact. Those kinds of long sentences and the obliqueness of that book, right, where it's about this guy who's dying, right, who did horrible things during the Pinochet era, but part of the book is like circling around the fact that he, like all these images that are related to it but not related, that had a big impact, definitely.
And the last question, like I have before we open up to Q&A, if anybody has any questions, would be like, so Mauro, like I have read that like it took you a while to write the first book, right? It took you, what was it, 10 years? 12 years. And then suddenly, like soon afterwards, like after 2 years came Aphasia. And then you're already talking about a third one. Is it like become exponentially like faster, the writing, or what's going on there?
Yeah, it's I think because in the first book, I was still grappling with too many questions at the same time. Like, what is fiction for me? Like, what kind of tradition do I want to be part of? What's the style that most accommodates what I'm trying to do? What am I trying to do? Right? All these questions, like, they're all kind of happening at the same time. So it took a very long time to figure it out. And at the same time, I was like learning just the basics of fiction, right? So I felt that when I finished the Revolutionaries Try Again, I felt like, I think I know what I'm doing. And I almost had like this energy that got bottled up from the first one. And I immediately took that energy to write the second one. And so I finished this one in 3 years. I finished the third one in 2. So,
Mauro, this means that you're progressively becoming Cesar Aira.
that's right. And what becomes really actually fascinating, at least to me, is that I have come to realize that the style that I've chosen, this kind of like taking things out and writing these kind of sentences, does not lend itself for novels that are greater than 200 pages. So my second one is like just like Aphasia, is almost like is exactly 200 pages. It just, there's the intensity of the approach, and the fact that you take out so much. It doesn't, you can't write a 500-page, novel in that style. I mean, you could, I guess, but I had found it not to be a very productive approach.
Yeah. And what's in that regard, what's your relationship to books? Because, for example, like I am the type of reader that like often like feels irresponsible, because I often go into books and just read 100 pages because I'm interested mainly about style and what is happening there and what the writer is doing there. So I was wondering, what's your relationship? Do you always read from beginning to end? Do you like often like
Never.
enter books and like kind of like exit? Yeah, tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, no, I almost never finish books. I'm usually, because I've been working on writing books, almost nonstop since I started the first one. I'm always reading books in a sort of vague relationship to what I'm writing, right? And so I'll open a book, I'll get the style of the book and be like, okay, I get it, I'm out. And then 10 years later, I'll open it again and keep reading it. I love books. I mentioned other books because then I immediately order those books, right? To see like, okay, maybe this book has a connection to what I'm writing. And then I'll order a bunch of books. And then sometimes a book will sit there for years, and then I'll be kind of bored at home and I'll take it off the shelf and be like, oh, wait, this is related, right? And so I think I do a lot of that. I do a lot of kind of reading bits and books, and sometimes that's why I like writing an essay, because it forces me. Like when I was writing about Krasznahorkai, I was going to interview Krasznahorkai. I was like, okay, I have to read all his books, right? So I took a lot of notes, and like all these things. And I actually like doing that because it was focused. But if it weren't for that, like I would like his last book, which is wonderful. I save it for special occasions. I read 100 pages and then be like, okay, I'm gonna save the rest, and then I'll read 100 more and so on. So
it's like a suite.
yeah, exactly.
Mauro, I think we have a question from Steven Sparks, who is asking if you can talk a little bit about how failure as a theme runs throughout your work.
Failure as a theme. Yeah, I think there's probably a number of failures running through the book. And by the way, Steven Sparks, he is the bookseller that and friend who introduced me to my editor at FSG.
Wow.
Long before he was an editor at FSG. I think one day he just sent an email to both of us saying, "You two should meet. You like the same books, the absurdist, weird books." Anyway, I think in Aphasia especially, there's a number of failures. I'll try to focus on one, which is Antonio is very aware of the failures, his failures towards his former wife, his failure towards his former girlfriends, his failures towards his sister. I think there's some passages where Antonio kind of tries to find a way to almost like mechanically say, I have failed my sister before, I'm about to do it again. What can I do to not sort of accept this failure towards others? You know what I mean? Because it's part of like, we can rationalize our failures when we relate to others fairly easily, right? Because that's the way we move on, right? Oh, blah, blah, blah. And because of our day-to-day sort of existence, sometimes when somebody's going through a hard time, we find ways to pretend that they're not, so that you don't have to deal with that, right? And so Antonio tries to, through kind of readings, through listening to his mother, I think at some point, like he feels like having sort of his mother's voice on the headphones helps him ground himself to the love he feels for her, even though he doesn't talk to her very often. And that helps him kind of connect himself to his sister and be able to say, oh my God, like, I love my sister. We grew up together. Even though we were never close as adults, I still have some kind of responsibility towards her. I must be, I must be there for her. And at some point, like, he finds himself finding ways to not talk to her on the phone because he doesn't want to disrupt his work. And so he ends up, putting time in his calendar every day. So he blocks time in his calendar so that at that time he'll talk to his sister, and it becomes like a ritual. So the ritual allows him to be present and not sort of fail her again.
Great. So Mauro, I guess like the last question I had, and I wanted to take the opportunity to make it before we run out of time, was regarding information. It seems like it's a novel also about how to just like take all of this information that we have, like, and just try to like build something out of it. And in that sense, it reminded me about like another book that you mentioned here, which was Doc's Newberry Report, right, by Lucy Elment, and like that whole idea of just like taking everything and just building something out of it.
Yeah, I think I find the association between things to be very beautiful. Meaning, like when you take Richard Greaves' sort of art and you connect it to Sebald, and you connect it to Bernhard. One of my favorite parts in the book, which I didn't plan, was when the character is like it's him and his girlfriend reading Chekhov. They're on the train, and then they break up, and then he's in the train again, and he's like listening to Mary Gaskell read Nabokov, and that sort of and so there's all these sort of connections. I find those associations, that stream of association, very beautiful. You know what I mean? It's almost like there is a dramatic beauty in disparate images connecting with each other. And to me, like those impulses that I was talking about and using them as a way to connect certain images is what I really like, and what I hope becomes what's exciting about those kinds of sentences, right? These linkages become exciting in and of themselves,
Amazing. And we have one question from Gabriela. Gabriela, you want to ask the question, or should I just say it out loud? Me, I say it? Good. So it's, hi, Mauro. Music was very important in your first novel. I was wondering about its importance, either in the form of the novel, sentence length, or theme.
Yeah, definitely. I think in the second book, Antonio spends a lot of time by himself in the office listening to Messiaen and Arvo Part and Steve Reich. And when I was writing the book, I was listening to Steve Reich quite a bit. And a lot of the pieces that are very repetitive, right? I think 8 Lines is the one that I listened to the most from Steve Reich. And that musicality where there's a certain sort of pulse, right? And Steve Reich often talks about that pulse in his pieces, right? There's always these pulse and things happen around it. Was actually very influential, I think, in the sentence, because the impulse is the pulse, right? And then everything around it is kind of what I'm trying to sort of connect together. And so I have found that, especially in the second one and the third one, that's the best way for me to write, to listen to these kinds of long pieces that sort of so-called minimalist pieces that have that sort of pulse, help me, because rhythm is a way to keep a long sentence going, right? Where you're trying to connect two things are disparate to one another. Rhythm and sound allow you to connect it. So the reader kind of through sound thinks that they're connected, right? And so I think that's definitely an influence, both on the first one and the second one.
Great. Is there any other question? I think otherwise, Mauro, I think we're getting close to the hour. But amazing book. Buy it, Aphasia. It's, as Mauro was saying right now, I hadn't thought, Mauro, about that idea of like seriality and like Steve Reich, but definitely there's that like idea of it's kind of like a pulse that begins to gather kind of like in a kind of like hurricane almost sort of way, and kind of begins to build, and halfway through you as a reader really begin to like feel like kind of the emotional power of the novel. So anyways, Mauro, congratulations.
Well, Carlos, thank you so much. You're such a great interviewer. Mauro, congratulations. This is really such an awesome book.
Thank you.
And, encouraging everyone, we've posted links. Buy a book. It supports City Lights. It's a good cause. We're not out of the woods as far as COVID. We're kind of trying to make the ends meet. So every book you buy really kind of goes towards kind of keeping us alive. We're going to be posting this event on YouTube in the next few days. So kind of keep an eye on our social media. And, also check out our calendar. There's a bunch of stuff coming up. We have this really cool event with this guy wrote a book on Sun Ra and his connection to Chicago. That's going to be coming up in December. We've got Ishmael Reed kind of reading poetry. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff. So, keep an eye on the calendar. Drop by the store. We're there 7 days a week, open at noon. And look forward to seeing you all really, really soon. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ciao. Buenas noches.
Buenas noches.
Bye-bye.
Ciao.